As part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will describe whether your directors attended last year's annual shareholders meeting and what your company policy is about director attendance at annual meetings. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek. I'm a big fan of yous. So before I bring on Bob and Jane to explain how to provide this disclosure in more detail, let's run down some of the basics. The legal requirements. Item 7D of Schedule 14A requires companies to disclose the information required by Item 407B of Regulation SK. What to disclose? Under Item 407B2, you're required to describe the company's policy, if any, regarding director attendance at annual meetings in a statement of the number of directors who attended the prior year's annual meeting. Alternatively, a company may provide the company's website address, the URL, with the same information as posted. So this is a very short piece of disclosure, typically one paragraph in the proxy. The instruction to Item 407B2 provides companies with the option to post their board attendance policy on their website instead of disclosing it in the proxy. And if you decided to post it on the IR webpage for your company, you need to disclose the URL for that in your proxy, the website address for that in your proxy. Under Item 407B2, you're required to state the number of directors who attended the prior year's annual meeting, but there's no requirement to identify any directors who missed the meeting. In fact, you don't have to disclose how many missed it. You just disclose the number who attended. Kind of silly disclosure, huh? I think so. It's so ridiculous. Shareholders are left to do the math of how many directors you have and how many attended last year's meeting, if they care. It should not be a surprise that I have not seen any company voluntarily cough up the name of any directors who missed the meeting. You don't have to disclose and identify who exactly missed the meeting, and companies don't do it. So let's look at a few examples. Amazon has one single sentence about this. And then here's Microsoft's policy. Their policy is that directors attend if practicable. Southern Company's proxy discloses that directors are expected to attend the upcoming meeting. And Cognizant's policy is also about the directors that are expected to attend, but they do go further and disclose who chaired last year's annual meeting and that the directors attended by teleconference. You're not required to disclose the manner in which directors attended, whether they're there in person or by Zoom or by teleconference, but Cognizant clearly wanted to be transparent, and that's always nice. Location. The SEC doesn't dictate where this disclosure goes. Companies typically provide the disclosure in the proxy, not online, as they have the option to do. And this disclosure is often baked into the section in the proxy where board meeting attendance is provided, but sometimes it's not. It might be elsewhere, perhaps where the director election proposal is located. Anyways, let's bring on Bob and Jane to hear more. My guests today, Bob Lamm and Jane Storero, are two of my all-time favorites. Bob has seen it all, done it all, been there, done that. He's been in-house at 6 different companies over his storied careers. 6! The last being Pfizer in New York. He's now a shareholder of Gunster down in southern Florida, still as busy now as he was 45 years ago. He contributes to that firm's Securities Edge blog with a regular column. So I've known Bob 20 to 25 years. I've known Jane even longer. She lived in the DC area for a considerable length of time and has now relocated up near Philadelphia, where she has her own consulting practice. She's been in-house with Pepco here in DC and done the law firm thing too. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. Jane and Bob, thanks so much for doing this. Talk about a topic that doesn't get any airtime at any of the conference you ever go to. Such a small piece of the disclosure in your proxy, but yet, since virtual meetings become such a big deal last year, this is a good topic right now. So Jane, what's the typical policy for director attendance look like? How short is that?
Typically, I like them to be very short and sweet. There's not much to say here, so I don't think that you need to have a long policy. You just state what the policy is regarding attendance, and then have another sentence that talks about what happens if a director has to miss, who has to approve that at the company, whether it's the chair of the board or the governance committee or some similar position.
And Bob, where would you put that policy typically? Standalone? Is it just
I
in
think
minutes?
most of the time I've put it in the corporate governance guidelines. And I would actually keep it shorter than Jane said. I would just say something really short and sweet, like, directors are expected to attend the annual meeting of stockholders. One company that I worked for had a policy that said that, but then said, except in extraordinary circumstances. But the circumstances that occurred that resulted in a director's non-attendance, may or may not have been viewed as extraordinary by an impartial observer. And I said, why do we even say that? If they can make it, they can make it. There's no real, again, aside from the fact that investors like to see the board members, and I think directors should make themselves available to be seen by investors, there's no real penalty. So I just keep it really simple.
And companies have the option to have this disclosure about the policy in their proxy, or they can post the policy on their corporate website, on the IR web pages. I don't think I've ever seen that, Jane. Have you? Having it posted on the site?
I've seen it posted on the IR website if it's part of the corporate governance policies, obviously, because those are typically posted up there so that you can direct investors to what the policies are. I have not seen in a very long time a standalone policy posted up there, but I won't say it never happens if that's how the company has decided to deal with this issue.
And Bob, have you seen, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, same here. I mean, if it's in the corporate governance guidelines, it's posted on your website. So I've seen once or twice where there was a separate statement about different director obligations, and that was included in there. Like Jane, I don't think I've ever seen one that was just about director attendance at shareholder meetings.
And then what about the virtual meetings? Companies had to change on the fly if you had a fiscal year end of 12/31 this year. In a way, it's easier for directors to attend the meeting if it's virtual because they can do it from anywhere. But logistically, I'm not, you might not be aware of how the board members were actually presented as part of the broadcast.
I think it was done in a number of different ways. Sometimes it was just noted at the meeting that the full board was present at the meeting, and sometimes I saw companies show pictures of the directors, their headshots, as opposed to actually showing the directors, sitting somewhere. But I think that the virtual meeting makes it extremely difficult to say that you can't attend, because short of a director being in the hospital, for instance, everybody can get on Wi-Fi and, plug into the meeting and be able to participate to the extent they're required to. So I think the virtual meeting helped with that. I mean, in any event, attendance at the annual meeting when a year in advance, to me, that's low-hanging fruit. It should be simple for any director to comply with it.
Even for an in-person meeting, a director that couldn't be there physically, if they dialed in by teleconference somehow so that they can listen to the proceedings. And I guess if someone in the audience wanted to address that, like let's say they were a chair of a committee, wanted to address them, I know some companies allow for that and that's considered attendance, but I imagine that's not too common.
Well, like you said, I think it's good to make them available. I mean, obviously, somebody who's the chair of the comp committee, I think really should be there virtually, in person, or whatever. And if the comp committee chair couldn't make it in person, I think having him or her on the phone is really important, only because if there is a question raised about executive comp, I've never seen it go well if the CEO decides to answer the question. So you want to have that presence. But I'm with Jane. I think, you know about these dates years in advance, or at least a year in advance. What's the big deal about being there? I was corporate secretary at several very troubled companies, but one very troubled company in particular. There had been lots of articles in the press, where was the board kind of articles. And I really strongly urged them to sit on the stage facing the audience rather than sitting in the front row of an auditorium with their backs to the audience and, getting up and doing the Queen Elizabeth thing, I finally persuaded them, and it was helpful. So having that presence there, showing that they're at least making an effort, I think is really important and helpful.
That's a very good point, Bob, because it really shows the dedication of the board to the company and its management team when they show up for these things. And it's important for the shareholders to see that the board is there and they're supportive of what the CEO is saying and doing. And it's always the case that if there's issues with compensation, that the CEO, it's not going to go well with the CEO addressing it. It really has to be the chair of the board, the chair of the compensation committee, because people really want to hear from those individuals on that topic.
Yeah. One time, if you'll forgive me the anecdote, one time I attended a company shareholder meeting. The CEO, well, a question was asked that was highly technical about one component of the CEO's compensation. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't critical. And the CEO, I think, because it wasn't critical, decided he would answer it himself. But because it was technical, he didn't get it exactly right. And then the head of executive comp stood up and said, well, that's, it just turned into a mess. And also, if you have the directors on stage, it depends on the format of the meeting, obviously. But if you have them on stage, it's much easier for the CEO to say, why don't we direct that question to Joe Schmo, who's chairman of the Zip Zap committee, than if he has to point down in the audience and the guy has to stand up and turn around and do a whole bunch of other things. So it's not a universally followed practice. I don't even think it's remotely a common practice. I've only seen it a couple of times, but I think it's a good practice.
Yeah, normally the directors are sitting in the front row and there's like 4 rows behind them, not reserved, but just for whatever reason, the shareholders don't fill in behind them. At the beginning of the meeting, the meeting chair, usually the board chair, will recognize them and they'll just stand up either as a group or one at a time, and they'll raise, like you said, give a wave, and you don't see them again or hear from them until after the meeting. Maybe some of the shareholders will go down and get autographs or what, depends on who the directors are.
I think a lot of the directors liked talking to shareholders after the meeting, and assuming that there weren't issues and it wasn't a hostile conversation, it was really enjoyable for them to touch base with the directors for a bit.
Yeah, when I was in-house, over half the audience were employee shareholders, or employees. So that's a great opportunity for the board to get to meet the rank and file.
It's kind of like when I first started going to Council of Institutional Investor meetings. Once you've sort of broken bread, even if it's just talking over a cup of coffee, it humanizes your board. They may not be ordinary people, but they are people. And I just think it helps. I just don't see any downsides to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.